listening to The Fan Marillion, an unofficial companion podcast for the Amazon Prime series The Rings of Power. I'm your host, Glorfindoll, reacting to the show each week and gushing over it like the precious. This time, we're covering Rings of Power Episode 5, Partings. So if you haven't watched it yet, turn back now, because there's going to be a Mithril mine full of spoilers. So what were the highlights on Tolkien's social media this week? Aside from being meme-hungry vagrants, fans praised Orlando Bloom as he low-key joined his other castmates in a show of support for Rings of Power actors on social media. Orlando posted a happy pic next to Arondir's Ismael Cruz Cordova with the caption, Melon, the Elvish word for friend, heart emoji. And in other behind-the-scenes news, we learned that the Amazon gang will be heading to New Zealand as filming for Rings of Power Season 2 begins next month. So what happened on Rings of Power? I rate this episode 1 glass of wine, which is the best rating possible. It means I was so riveted throughout the episode, I didn't need to refill at all. A stark contrast to where I found my feelings last week. Do I have concerns? Yes, and I'll get to them. But let me bask in this feeling of utter relief after holding my breath. As I gripe throughout today's Fan Marillion, please bear in mind I can't express enough how much I enjoyed this episode of Rings of Power. And then I wondered, is there a particular writer on the show that I'm gravitating to? Is there a theme to my episode ratings and who's done the writing or the directing? Well, I checked, and there's not a clear trend emerging yet, but I'll monitor that for the rest of the season to see if a trend becomes clear. This episode was titled Partings, so who parted ways with whom? It was a well-assembled episode on this theme. Durin left Lindon to head back home to the dwarves. The Harfoots continued their migration west. In future Mordor, half of the Southmen left the Watchtower to pledge allegiance to the Dark. And the Númenórean fleet departed for Middle-earth. We spend 1 hour and 6 minutes following these episode threads. And unlike with previous episodes, I felt like with this one, I got a pleasant and thorough experience in all 4 threads. In Lindon, the heat on the dwarves' new Mithril find is hot, hot, hot. It turns out that King Durin was absolutely right to be suspicious of the elves' arrival in Khazad-dûm, bearing the Trojan horse of Durin Jr.'s good friend. What a coincidence indeed! In fact, this encounter was brilliantly manufactured by King Gil-galad, who knew of both Elrond's great friendship as well as his love for Celebrimbor's work and smithing in general. Gil-galad was out here playing chess, giving ambitious and clever Elrond a chance to show his quality, knowing full well how he would go about showing that quality. And what is it that Gil-galad wanted? The Mithril! And he just comes right out with it at dinner during his toast. He can't help but bring it up in a not at all low-key reference to their secretive new dig. Gil-galad, you codpiece. That dinner sequence was an absolute joy to watch, as are any scene between Durin and Elrond for that matter. Especially when Durin demands that Elrond give him the meat, and give it to him raw. Historians will stress they were just good friends. Also, this episode gave us the excellent phrase I will be using from here on out, enough with the quail sauce. And no wonder Celebrimbor was a nervous wreck last week if he thinks they're all dying from some loss of light. More on that later. Let's start with Mithril. What do we know of Mithril from the canon that can help us understand what's happening here? Well, in the Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf described it as an ore that all folk desired, because it could be beaten like copper and polished like glass. and yet stronger than all other ores. When it was still being mined, mithril was worth 10 times its weight in gold. But once its only source in Khazad-dûm was cut off from the dwarves, it became priceless. Hence why Gandalf said that Frodo's mithril mail shirt was worth more than the value of the Shire. I posited last week if the presence of the Balrog in the depths of Khazad-dûm might have played a role in the creation of mithril. After all, this rare ore is discovered in this very special mountain, a mountain special for lots of reasons. It was a curious parallel that was never touched on in the lore, but I wondered if the showrunners might satiate that curiosity and lean in. And they did exactly that by establishing a Balrog and Silmaril battle backstory for the creation of the mithril ore. What you saw in this episode, the roots of Hithaglir, which is the Misty Mountains, where Khazad-dûm is located, this story dressed up like a serving of lore on a platter, was actually Amazon fanfiction. However, I really liked it. It's a game. You take something generic, like just mining for a special ore, and you paste in a Maiar and a bolt of lightning, and you somehow tie it to the curse of Fëanor, and voila! You've given an otherwise bland story about mining the Silmarillion treatment, and you've transformed it into a delicious turkey dinner. I'm not ashamed to admit how easy it is to do that for me and make me happy. I'm here for the high fantasy, regardless of the author, and I got it. I will take my fake-ass Silmarillion lore that I got tonight and munch on it and enjoy it. I love this new twist. Now how about its smithing? Well, in the canon, the elves of Eregion did work together with the dwarves on mithril. The elves made their alloy that only shows in starlight or moonlight from the mithril. You might remember the moon runes from The Hobbit, or recall the door into Moria with that moonlit gateway where you have to speak Friend in Elvish to enter. That alloy was mithril. The elves of Eregion and the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, neighbors that they were, collaborated on the smithing of mithril throughout time. And we know from The Lord of the Rings that Galadriel's ring of power she bears in Lothlorien, forged by Celebrimbor, was made of mithril. So we knew mithril had to get involved in any story about the rings of power. And I like that they're elevating this ore to a point of interest rather than just an informational footnote. So why does King Gil-galad want the mithril? Well, the tree of Lindon is dying, which suggests to him that elves, whose life force is quite similar to that of this tree, will shortly follow suit. And since the light of a Silmaril comes from that very early sacred light source of Valinor, he thinks infusing everyone with a bead of mithril, aka Silmaril light, I guess, will give them the boost they need to not die right now. What a stretch, but I don't hate it. It could be fun. And is setting up the elves of this story to be just nervous and perhaps desperate enough to respond favorably to the future events we all know are coming, as the show is titled Rings of Power. Sauron needs more than to just go a-forging. He needs his targets to be in a position where they believe they need Rings of Power. This new light of their soul crisis could be that storytelling trigger for the showrunners. And it's funny, my friends often text me right after the episode. They like to guess what is fake lore and what is real lore. And I got several texts right away that said this is fan fiction. And I said, yes. It's just silly enough that it couldn't possibly be real. What Gil-galad doesn't do is seek to address the source of the light loss. Giving elves the light of mithril right now is kind of like if one of my aquariums cracked and it started to leak water, I just keep adding water every day until my apartment floods, rather than find the leak and plug it. Especially because Galadriel basically identified the source in episode 1 for him, and he was like, "Oh no, you're annoying. You need to leave." Why Gil-galad doesn't seem concerned about the source of the elves' light drain is above my pay grade. For now, we just know that there is a movement against light that is taking root in Middle-earth, illustrated by the decline of the great tree of Lindon, which came from a sprig of one of the 2 great trees you saw in Valinor in the first 5 minutes of Rings of Power. Yes, those trees. So, the tree of Lindon is very quote-unquote linked in to the earth and the light of the Valar, and all of those fantastical themes. This would be a good time to tell you that the sun and the moon are the last vestiges of the 2 trees of Valinor themselves, hence why their tree progeny in Lindon would be so susceptible to changes of sacred light and are serving as an early warning sign to Gil-galad that something is rotten in the state of Denmark. In the same episode this week, we also saw Adar laying it on thick for us, in case viewers didn't quite grasp what Gil-galad is addressing. We see Adar soaking up the light of the sun for the last time, since he and his orcs have revealed their intentions to transform the realm into one of ever-darkness, so that orcs can roam free. I suspect that these themes will very much tie together with the unveiling of orc history. That is, these were elves whose light was taken from them during Morgoth's reign, and Adar feels like he's simply giving something back to them as a sort of reparation and epic redemption for the sins of their forefathers' failure to protect them from Morgoth. Again, this has been hinted, but not outright said. So ultimately, I may have Adar's goals incorrect here, but given what Saruman provided us in the Fellowship of the Ring, I think this is why Adar is Team Orc and aiding Sauron in giving them a land of their own. The Harfoots continued their migration southwest from Norfield Glen, where they eat their tasty escargot and are headed to a great grove of fruit and vegetables. By the way, on that map, did you notice where they are at last? The map gave us answers. I had felt some shots during this leg of the Harfoot story evoked images of Rohan from the 2 towers, and we learned this episode that was no accident. They are actually quite close to Rohan. The Harfoots are migrating all around the Brown Lands to the west of the River Anduin. I shared a map on my socials on Friday for you to take a look. It aligns the Harfoots' migration route, as revealed in Episode 5, to the modern-day Middle-earth we know and love from the novels and the movies. So, thousands of years later, to the north will be the elven lands of Lothlorien and King Thranduil's Mirkwood, on either side of the Anduin River, and then to their south is the Emyn Muil, an entrance to ancient Gondor. This is to say, they are nowhere near the future location of the Shire. So, we can assume that getting these Harfoots to what will eventually become the Shire settlements will be a very interesting story development over the course of these 5 seasons. Perhaps Gandalf will prove instrumental in relocating them there, because right now, they're mighty close to the Southlands that are now overrun with Adar's orcs. Be careful, my babies. So, during the Rings of Power, who is in residence in the future Shire? A complicated question. Actually, Gil-galad's kingdom of Lindon is pretty close. There's also the dwarves of the Blue Mountains close by. But there's not a distinct kingdom in the future Shire at this exact time. The region of the Shire at this time is called Eriador, and right north of it is eventually going to be settled by Númenóreans and called Arnor. So the migration continues, and Gandalf is being a great help with the cart. He's also bonding well with the Harfoots, taking just tea, thank you, with them, and all sorts of wonderful Gandalfisms, including whispering otherworldly charms to heal his arm after protecting the Harfoot gang from roving bands of wolves. It was in the wolf attack that we saw my new favorite form of Gandalf, Capoeira Gandalf. He also body slammed the earth and got the wolves the heck out of there, but took heavy +5 damage. It was while he was lost in a trance healing his arm that he accidentally hurts Nori, and for the first time, Nori is afraid of him. This will be an interesting contrast for the remaining season now that the rest of the Harfoot troupe has changed their tune and are pro-Gandalf, seeing the inarguable benefits of keeping a wolf annihilator as part of their merry band. This episode's Harfoot wandering montage was tearful and perfect and peak Shire vibes, despite being nowhere near the Shire. It was so beautiful and exactly what I needed to bring me back from the brink where I was last episode. Poppy's song in particular sings the famous line from Bilbo's poem, "Not all those who wander are lost," and this line of song overlays a sorrowful Gandalf staring up at the stars. Also tied into the Harfoot and Gandalf journey is our first glimpse at some ne'er-do-wells in clerical robes who seem to be investigating our meteor man. They definitely seem to know something. So it's lucky then that Gandalf appears to be regaining some of his memory in this episode. Let's hope that he's up to the task once these mystery clerics track him down, and I think they will. Down in the Southlands, Bronwyn passes on Adar's message about fealty to the dark powers, which she thinks is pretty inspirational, but as it turns out, about half the menfolk disagree and head over to Adar asking, "Yes, can I pledge fealty to you, please and thank you?" Bronwyn and Arandar are Pikachu shock gif / not shocked at this turn of events. As Theo notes, this illustrates nicely why the elves have been monitoring this part of the world since the days of Morgoth. As I said last week, Southlanders are tricky-dicky for the dark side. But what we also learn this episode is that it's not necessarily their fault. The Morgoth-era artifact in Theo's possession appears to have a dark magic control on these people's bloodlines. As illustrated by some ancient art at the Watchtower, this artifact is somehow essential to Sauron's intentions for the South. And this episode, we learn it's likely how he controls these genetic lines. The Southland story this episode leaves us hanging as Bronwyn loses hope upon learning that her fate is predetermined by her blood and essentially gives up. And Adar's orc army sets off towards the Watchtower, bleeding a powerful chant as they walk. Ooh, shivers. Over in Numenor, we start to see the real Alfarasan at last. Conniving, ambitious, very politically motivated. He is not so concerned with the risks of heading to Middle-earth because he's got his eye on the prize, the perks of colonization. And no matter how this plays out, Alfarasan knows exactly how to come out on top by playing his cards close to his chest and approaching things very carefully, a tactic he tries to impart onto his son this episode, but his son and his new girlfriend are both too short-sighted and or hot-headed to grasp the game of chess Alfarasan intends to play here. Or they simply don't agree. Either way, his son tries to burn down the whole fleet. Oh, sweet summer child. He succeeds in only blowing up one of those ships. So, the plan to sail to Middle-earth and assist the Southlanders is still a go. And, while in Numenor this episode, we see that Elendil is an excellent father. In media, we often see absent fathers, shitty fathers, abusive fathers, fathers on their way out the door. But Elendil is a grade A father. We've got Isildur, brazen, confused, drowning in malaise, anti-establishment, but at the same time wanting desperately to be part of the establishment, Isildur is a fucking teenage testosterone mess. We see his friends and family come down on him and call it out. Elendil especially brings his son to task this episode on his wishy-washy civic ambitions and wanderlust and puts his foot down. He then gives him a humiliating job cleaning the horse pens, making him work from the bottom again and prove his commitment to his goals. And given what happens at Mount Doom in Isildur's future, Elendil is trying his best to coach his son out of what will eventually be a permanent character flaw, I'm afraid. But Elendil, I love how committed you are to trying. Let's just say it won't be Elendil's fault that Isildur turns into a shit show. Elendil, if you were to launch a Match.com account today, you would be besieged by applicants. There is literally nothing hotter in our age bracket than a committed single father. Hot? Check. Leader? Check. Raising his kids? Check. Speaks several languages? Check. Hair waves for days? Check. I don't know how thirsty fans can look at Halbrand when Elendil is standing right there. But also, over on Match.com, Arondir was gunning for hot single stepdad this week as well, as he coached young Theo on bravery and taught him how to shoot. Galadriel, God love her, she hasn't changed her clothes in a week, but she was on fire this episode. Up to now, Galadriel has been a thorn in my side. Her characterization has been questionable, and I've not been shy about expressing that on this podcast. However, we're just talking about episode 5 right now, so that doesn't factor into my wine rating. In episode 5, we got Commander Galadriel, and she was excellent. Her training sequence with Elendil's soldiers, top-notch. Was it peak Pirates of the Caribbean? Yes, but I can forgive and forget because I loved it. And now Isildur's friend is a lieutenant thanks to her and Elendil's little training game. Well done, Lieutenant! So Galadriel gives these soldiers some hot tips for fighting orcs, which she notes will be much needed since these fresh, clean lads have never even been in a war, much less seen and fought an orc. Remember, Numenor has been closed off from outsiders for several generations at this point, so it's easy to understand Galadriel's concerns that this army might not be the saviors the Southland needs. This episode, we also see Halbrand successfully worked over with Galadriel's and Queen Regent's mind games and genetic enforcement of his life goals. I gotta say, I really do hate how these ladies essentially force him into a very dangerous role that he's firmly expressed again and again he doesn't want. Just because your parents did this or that should, by our modern standards, have no bearing on your own personal pursuits of happiness, but for some reason, we let these ideals slide while reading and watching fantasy, which is so entrenched in monarchies and lineage and predetermined destinies. I mean, we're supposed to be here shouting at Halbrand to fulfill his birthright, go save a land and a people he doesn't want anything to do with, and risk his life for the privilege of doing so. And then we log off, and in the same breath, commend Prince Harry for exiting the British royal family for his wife's safety. So watching fantasy really tests our values. I had a hard time at this stage of my life rooting for Halbrand's new look and mission as the ships depart. I, and perhaps many modern audiences, aren't going to be able to get past the gaslighting and emotional manipulation that's putting him in this line of fire against his will, simply because of who his parents are. Somehow, it worked for Aragorn 20 years ago, but it's not working for me for Halbrand having the same mission today. I guess you could say that Aragorn wanted it, so that's a big difference. But then again, Aragorn grew up and was raised in Rivendell, being groomed his whole life for that exact task. So who knows? Morals and free will are a bit gray in Middle-earth. That final sequence of the episode sealed the deal for me. As if I wasn't already enthralled, the departure from Numenor had me choking up. Even though I don't want the Numenorians to leave because it'll set off a major chain of events to come, the music, the lighting, the boarding of the ships, that skyline though, the way the camera just veered around it was all so intense. And oddly placed, given it being episode 5, this felt more like the mid-season finale that I said was missing last week. Well, I finally got it. The only thing that really pulled me out of the sequence was Galadriel suddenly wearing the armor she left on the ship that went to Valinor. That was odd. Like, I assume there's a deleted scene somewhere that has Elendil and Galadriel going through some old storage from the older days when elves in Numenor were tight, but I think that scene should not have been deleted because that really threw me and is a huge continuity violation. It's just, the episode is already an hour plus. What's another 30 seconds to avoid that kind of snafu, you know? And this Numenor departure sequence was Bear McCreary at his best, pulling my heartstrings and somehow having me rooting for characters I spent all of my last podcast lambasting. Bear has that black magic. Bear McCreary is Sauron. I want to talk specifically about the music for this episode at large. If you knew nothing about this show, but you were familiar with Bear's work, you could listen to the episode from the kitchen and just know it's him. Some composers love their bassoons, some composers get off to their brass sections, but Bear brings in singers all the time because he knows how to use them to elevate any piece of score. The orc chanting is so evocative and weaved into the orchestra's rising tension. He makes brilliant use of human voices, which makes sense because who better to tap into the range of human emotions than our own voices? And in complete contrast, we got Poppy's travel song over those sweeping landscape and map shots. Then there's the tavern music from Numenor about sailing the open seas. If you were waiting for the show to start feeling more like a Tolkien novel, this was it. Songs and poems and sweet tavern jams. That's Tolkien, Professor British, Lord of the Pub. We'll talk all about where things go in Middle-earth from here on the next episode of The Fan Marillion. Let's start closing this down with the trivia question. Where was J.R.R. Tolkien born and raised? I raised this trivia question because this week's Rings of Power episode devotes much time to the mining of mithril and other minerals, such as Gil-galad's table that Durin brings home. The answer is that Tolkien was born in South Africa, in a heavy mining location, so it's possible his great interest in mining in general, and his wealth of knowledge about it, came from his time there, where mines run exceptionally deep and intricate. And thank you to everyone who joined us on Twitch TV on Thursday for Fan Marillion's Tolkien Trivia, where we played questions for the food and music of Middle-earth. Join us on Twitch every Thursday before the episode at 9 o'clock Eastern Time. We'll pregame together and help you stay awake for the Rings of Power episode to drop. To put it on your calendar and see instructions for joining, find next week's event on our Facebook page. Next week's trivia theme will be The Hobbit. This is all things Hobbit, meaning the novel, the Jackson trilogy, and the Ralph Bakshi animation. And now for our vocab word. As the orcs marched to the watchtower housing Arondir and his human peeps, they chant Nampat. To accompany that chant, Nampat is also the name for that bit of score on the show's soundtrack. So, the vocab word this week is Nampat. But I'm telling you, I don't know what it means, and neither does the internet. This word, from what I can find, isn't referenced in any of Tolkien's published novels, notes, songs, or poems. That's pretty exciting because it could be nothing but a war chant, or it could become something very particular to Adar's people or Adar himself. You might ask, isn't this just another example of Amazon writers cutting corners? Or not a real word? Not so. Much of the Black Speech of Mordor, in fact, had to be created for the Peter Jackson movies so that the orcs could have lines in their own tongue, which was a very nice touch and helped convey the scope of Middle-earth. The idea that Tolkien's languages are finished products you can just take a class on and learn is a big misconception. He didn't publish a Webster's-style dictionary for all of his languages. What he did as a linguist was start at the bottom, crafting the building blocks for these languages. The rules, the conjugations, some root meanings, and all the little isms that make you go, when you hear a language spoken out loud. For example, you might not speak Latin fluently or even a little bit, but when you hear Latin in movies and TV, you know that's what you're hearing. That phenomenon is what Tolkien captures. He crafted the foundations for these languages and some vocabulary within his text that you can mine from characters' lines and from poems and songs. Nampat appears to be in line with this Elvish-based proto-Black Speech of Mordor that develops there that we know and love from Middle-earth and will come approximately 3,000 years after the Rings of Power. I'm Glorfindoll, and this was my show. I welcome your opinion, but remember, I'm not the whole fandom, I'm just a fan. Join the conversation at FanMarillion on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Twitch TV. Or, for flaming that's too spicy for socials, send me an email at fanmarillion@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
This has been an Opus Nox Media production. Produced and edited by Ali Bachman. For more information on Opus Nox Media, please visit opusnoxmedia.com.